Hello, I'm Dame Calandra from the Kingdom of the Golden Plains, and today we're going to be learning how to do embroidery. Now, embroidery is essentially applying decorative threads to another item. And there are many different stitches out there. There are hundreds, possibly even 1,000 stitches when you look through things. We're going to touch on some basic ones that will help you get started. I want to start with showing some pictures of some embroidery that I've done. So let me pull that up here. I don't have a lot of pictures because I'm really good at starting things and never finishing them. I think that's my one of my big traits there. So this was done for another organization, and this utilizes a lot of different stitches, some of which we're going to go over today with satin stitch and back stitching and hemp, or back stitching and stem stitch. But there's also some other ones in here that uses Bayou tapestry stitch in the castle and the face of the stag. And then we have a few other just simple things of just showing the starting out phases and different process, where I have a combination of split and chain stitch in the middle to fill things in, and using a stem stitch. And those are some of the stitches that we're going to go over. And this is that piece with a little more work into it. And so this one, well, there is some bits of chain that I decided I didn't like the way the chain was in the center, so then I went and added split in between it. The rest of it is all just stem stitch and split stitch. And so you can use as many stitches as you want, or just a couple stitches, or even just one stitch, and you can still come up with a beautiful project on there. This is something that I had made a long time ago on a bodice, and just simple things. You don't have to fill in everything. You can leave some places with just little accents and things. There's a lot of different options you can do, and it's really easy to get started with the embroidery. So as far as what you want to use, you can use a lot of different materials. You can use thin wool yarn. What you would look for is the word crewel, Crewel. That yarn tends to be thin enough to do some embroidery. Now that won't work on, thin cotton or something like that, but if you're embroidering on a wool cloak, that's a good material to use. You can get silk. Also, just even regular just cotton embroidery floss is easy to come by at most stores that sell any sort of craft supplies. There are differences in qualities, but that's something that even people have personal preferences with. You may hear of DMC floss, but there's also Coats and Clark and lots of other ones out there that you can get easily. Big thing with the embroidery floss, which what I have out here is Coats and Clark, and I have some DMC using also, is it comes in strands of 6. Uh, the skein is going to be 6 strands together. And depending on what you're doing and what effect you want on your project would depend on how many of those you want to pull apart. So you would cut off your piece of your embroidery floss and then pull apart how many you want. I'm using 3 right now. I usually use 2 to 3 depending on things. If you're wanting to use all 6, you would need to be using some sort of thick, heavy cloth, and also have to find the right needle for it. Embroidery needles tend to have a larger eye. I'm trying to get there. This one has a gold eye, but you really can't see that with the lighting here. They're not usually incredibly sharp, but they're not dull either. They're not to the point where they're going to try to make the pierce a hole completely in your fabric. Is it because the fabric that you want to use usually is going to have a little bit of openness already. You can use more solid fabrics, and for that you may need to have a sharper needle. There are some larger eye sharper needles that you can find with that. It's just you have to read the packages and what they tell you on there. Even weave fabric is preferred with embroidery. Most of your cotton fabrics that you're going to find are going to be even weave, unless they're twill or something like that. But if you were to go, say, get like the quilting cotton, that's going to be even weave. If you're doing something that's not counted, that will work well. If you're doing something that involves a counted stitch, you may want to have something that has a little bit looser of a weave, and not like incredibly loose, but one that where you can actually see the holes easily to count things. Linen is a good choice for that. What I'm using right now is actually a rayon linen blend because it's what I had accessible. It's got a lot of slubs in it, so that would make it really hard with doing counted work because those slubs would get in the way of things, and that's going to be these raised lines that you can see. Those are slubs. Uh, but you can really embroider on just about anything. You just have to watch how things work. Like on fleece, sometimes your thread will get buried into the things, and you just have to be careful on it. And embroidery hoops are great for stabilizing things. They come in many different sizes. I prefer not to use something more than 8 inches. This one is really like the most I would try to use. I think it is a 10, but it works well for this frame. This is called a tambour frame, so it'll hold everything in place. I do have a personal preference for plastic embroidery hoops. I find that they tend to be more stable, but everybody has their different preferences on how they want to do things. Just the main thing is that when you insert your embroidery hoop, you want, and I unfortunately do not have another one available at the moment, but I do have another video that demonstrates this. You want to lay the fabric face down on a surface, put the inner circle on the back of the fabric, and then put the other circle on the front and push it down, and then you're going to tighten it, and then you're going to pull the edges. So like I would pull the edges to try to tighten to get things to where I want, and then try tightening it again, because it should be kind of like a little drum head. There should be a little bit of give, but you shouldn't be able to push it like really far down. This one's actually not as tight as it should be, so we're going to tighten that. So you just kind of pull it gently all around. Now for getting started, there are a lot of people that will say you should never put a knot. Well, I disagree with that. I like starting with knots, and if you look at the backs of periods work, there actually are lots of knots and things. Now the trick is you want to keep things neat looking on the back. And so you can start with a knot and then still bury your threads. Because what people like to do is make a few stitches and you're catching the end of your tail end of your thread into the stitches. And I just find a knot is a helpful thing to start and then also bury things in. So we're going to start with making the knot. I leave a little bit of a tail. This is just my way of doing it. Many people have other ways of how they tie a knot. So for this demonstration purposes, it just makes it easier to do it this way. I usually do 2 or 3 over the same spot. I have my knot right there, and so I gently slide it to where it goes as close as I can get to that spot, usually over it. Because you don't want to pull everything all the way through. Okay. So I'm going to start with showing the basic stitch, the running stitch. If you've done any sort of sewing by hand, you've probably done this. This is not a locking stitch. So what that means is that if you were to end up pulling the thread on the other end, it will start trying to pull things in and gather things up. So you have to be mindful of that, of not pulling things too tight. So this one's a simple where you bring the thread up and then you just go back down. See, I don't want to pull too tight where it's trying to make a little hole there. So we have to watch the tension. And then you want to try to pull it up, just your needle up about equal distance in front of that first stitch. See, and I undid things because my knot, I gotta be mindful of that. Okay. And it happens. Make mistakes, you just start over. So we're just going to make a couple stitches. And this is the running stitch. There's a reason why I'm leaving my spaces. You can do it next to each other, but it won't look quite right. But this is good for adding some different textural effects or details on things. If you look at something called black work, which is common in medieval period, or red work or white work, it's pretty much just embroidered lines. The way that you start is the way we just started with the running stitch. And then you would go back and fill in the in-between. Now, there is a lot of calculations done. They try to, a lot of times, make it look the same on the front as it does on the back. And so sometimes you do have to do some counting and mathematics with that. But sometimes, you can't make it look perfectly even. So we're going back and filling in. And this is sometimes called a double running stitch. Sometimes people will call this a cobbler stitch, but that also, there's another stitch that's also a cobbler stitch. But that's your simple getting started with just filling things in. Another thing that you can do to get a line effect like that is called a back stitch. Now, if you've ever done cross stitch, then which is an embroidery stitch, the back stitch is something that's often used for making lines and outlining your details. So in this one, I'm going to start off just like I did with the running stitch. And then this time, when I pull the needle up in front of that first stitch, we're going to go back to that first stitch. So the end of the first stitch is where I'm going to put the needle down. This is a locking stitch, which is good for hand sewing if you're trying to make sure that things don't come apart. And so I go up in front of that last stitch again, and then I'm going to go put my needle down right at that tail end of that previous stitch. And that's your back stitch. And you can see how they are very similar. I just did the back stitch smaller than I did the running stitches. But there's a lot of similarity to that. It's just a matter of preference of how you want to do things. I find the back stitch quicker. That's my own personal preference. And I have been told that there are some evidence of some black work being done with back stitch. It won't look identical on the front and the back, but it's an option of things that you can do. So these are good for your outlines. Another stitch that's good for outlining and details is called a stem stitch. There are many different ways to do this. The way that I tend to do it is what works for me because of my wrist issues, but I will try to demonstrate a more common way of how it's done. So the way that I do it, and I have seen others examples of this, is I make a stitch. So that's that one right there. I'm going to make a stitch. I'm about halfway in the middle of that stitch. I'm on the outside. It's a little hard to see right here. Okay. I'm going to pull this up, and then I'm going to make another stitch in front of that first one to make it line up with that. So it's a little bit of an angle. It's a stacking. And then I'm pulling my needle up again about halfway to 3/4 alongside that last stitch I did. And so it kind of makes a little rope-like effect. And it's often used for flower stems and outlines. I'm just going to do another one here. Now I'm starting to curve it a little bit. And the trick with curves is to make slightly smaller stitches than what you had been doing. and will help ease into the curve. On the bodice that I have, I didn't do that very well, and so you can see the outsides of my stem stitch very, very prominently, and they shouldn't be. So I'm just making some slightly smaller stitches, and you have that little rope effect. Now, the way that a lot of instructions would say to do it, okay, I'm going to come up in front again, but this time I'm going to, when I put my needle in, I'm going to try to pull up to do multiple stitches at once here. Okay. It has you go backwards on it. Like it's a different way of, slightly different way of trying to put in. So I have it there, but then I'm also going to go ahead in one motion, pull up the next stitch. That's a little harder for me. And so I like doing it the way that I was showing it. And say I couldn't do that very well because also I have to do it with my non-dominant hand because of wrist issues. So it's a personal preference. There's a lot of different ways to do many of these things. So there's a couple stitches for getting started. So those are, as I said, outline stitches. Then we have our fill stitches, which some of them can be used for outlining too, such as a chain stitch or a split stitch. The satin stitch is pretty much just for fill. You wouldn't use that for outlining. If you've ever seen machine applique, which we have a lot of that in Amtgard in the different games we play, that is technically a satin stitch. It's on that. But and which I know is often used for outlining, it's easier to do it with a machine though as an outline than it is as by hand. Because by hand, usually you're still going to want to edge it in a back stitch or something like that. So a satin stitch, there are a couple different ways to do it. The first one is you make each stitch individually here. So I came up here and went down there. So then I'm going to go back to this first one over here. I'm going to put it right next to it. And I'm just going to go back then. And you're trying to fill in the area, so there shouldn't really be any visible gaps. This one is really one that's easy to pucker your fabric. So you want to watch your tension, that you're not pulling it too tight, because if you pull it too tight, you'll start pulling it in and you'll start seeing little gathers underneath your stitches where the fabric has been pulled too tight. So another way that you can do this, instead of just going up and down, is I came up here. I'm going to put my needle in where I would normally go down, but then I'm also going to put the end of my needle up right where that first stitch was starting. And then you can just do it that way. And I'm holding my finger right at that spot to try to help with the tension, because I find that if I don't, it makes it harder to guide it also and can cause issues. Now the satin stitch will cause your tension to ease on things. So you have to watch that. You may have to adjust your frame. So and I ended up with some spaces there. You can always undo things. So there's our satin stitch. So this is where normally would want to outline the edge a little bit. My needle's coming off my thread. It just helps to accent things, and also if you didn't get everything perfectly aligned in the right spots, then you can hide that a little bit with an outline stitch. Some people like to outline first and then do the fill in. I prefer to do a satin stitch first and then fill in or do the outline after it. Now, if I'm filling in with a chain stitch or split stitch, then I'll do the outline stitch first. And you may wonder, how do you get your designs onto your fabric? You have a lot of different choices on that. You can buy what's called transfer paper. There's fabric transfer paper, and there's iron-on, and then there's a type that you draw things on it. So you can get the iron-on transfers and just iron that onto your fabric. Some fabrics that may not work on it. With the stuff that you draw on, you would have your design, and then you place that on top of the trace of the transfer paper. Put the colored side of the transfer paper against your fabric, and then take a blunt object or a pen or something and go over the design that you have. Just trace over the design, and it will transfer it to your work surface. Okay, so now I'm up to a point where I can start my next stitch. So now we're going to show how to do chain stitch. So this can be used for outlining or filling in areas. The way you start this is going to be a little bit different than the continuing stitches. And I've got the twisties, so I'm going to try to straighten my thread out a little bit. It will do that. Thread really likes to twist back on itself and make little slip knots and things, so you have to watch that. A lot of times, if you just take the needle off and let it dangle a little bit, you can get it to straighten out. Sometimes there's just a point of no return where it doesn't want to do anything but spiral. Okay, so this is where it's a little tricky. So I came up here, I'm going just right in front of that. This is where I'm using my finger on the back to guide things. I am pulling my needle up just a little bit here. I have a little bit of fabric there. And I'm having the thread loop across here because we're going to form a loop. So that's my first chain. So then kind of use the thread to make a little loop in front of things. Go into the middle of that first stitch and then come up just a little bit in front of that again. Careful to make sure that the thread comes outside of the loop here. So there's my thread and then or my loop, and here we go. We're going to make the second loop, second chain. Now this is also good for hand sewing on stretchy fabrics because on the underside, it's going to make it look like a row of double running stitch or back stitch, like the way a front side of a back stitch would look. But it gives, it has a little bit of give to it, so it works well on stretchy fabrics, but it is also a pretty decorative little decorative stitch that you can do. And you want to try to keep your chains about the same size with your loops. And this one can go pretty fast. It's also good for embroidering names. I like using the chain stitch for names because I do find it fairly easy for that. Backstitch also works for that, but if you need something that has a little bit more depth to it, then a chain stitch is a good choice for that. Now, something that looks very similar to the chain stitch that is also used for filling in areas is the split stitch. So I'm going to pull my needle down, and this one, I'm going to come up in between the threads. So it's in the middle of those threads. And then I'm going to go back down again to make an equal distant stitch and just come back up in the middle again. So that's why it's a split stitch, because you're splitting the middle of the threads. I realize that's not showing very well there. Let me see if it shows better in the other thread. Let me try a different color here, see if that will show up better. Those are the basic stitches for getting started. And so there are many, many more. There are different variations of those that I just showed, but those are all things that are a very good start to just get you started on things. I'm going to try this other thread here in just a moment. If I can thread my needle. Now I know threading needles is something that people do have a lot of difficulty with, and you can get needle threaders. There's various styles for that. It's also good for teaching some hand-eye coordination sometimes. Okay, so let's try this other thread and see if it's more easy to see. And I'm going to make a, actually I'm going to make a bigger stitch to show this. Okay, so for splitting the stitch, I'm just going to come it right in the middle. And then the distance that I'm putting is from the top of the previous stitch to where I'm putting the needle should be the same size as my first stitch. Now you can do it as counted where you count the number of things. I use my visual judgment on that, but I know that that's not something everybody can do easily. So it's up to you on how you want to do that. Some people would mark the stitch spots when they're marking the pattern because they may do it as a dashed mark when they're putting the pattern on the fabric. And there are a lot of commercial patterns for embroidery that you can find that you can iron on that may have things marked that way. So that's showing that split stitch. The split stitch will go pretty fast as far as things. You want to periodically look at the back of your thing. I'm pretty sure this is kind of a mess because I didn't try to trap the stitches. Let's see if we can flip that over. Okay, it's not too bad. Because what I should have been trying to do is trap the tails into the stitches as I go. But with how this is set up, it was hard to do. But what I can do is I could take a needle and pull it back through to lock these stitches in place on there. That's showing the back side of things. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording now.